Não inventei o jiu-jitsu, mas modifiquei e adaptei ao fraco.
Hi guys, Professor Gustavo here. Today I'll be sharing the origins and history of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu based on well-known reliable sources and hard facts. Most of the topics I will cover were drawn from this 3-volume book called Muito Antes do MMA, or Way Before MMA, released a few months ago. This book collects all the new findings and details about the origins of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that have been made available by the Brazilian National Library since it became digitized about 12 years ago, facilitating the job of many research projects and historians. In this video, I will also refer to Dr. José Cairo's dissertation, in which he explains the interplay between Brazil's political regime and the evolution of our martial art. So in order to talk about the origins of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, we first need to talk about Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, which is a generic term for a family of martial arts practiced in Japan during its feudal age, predominantly by the samurai class on the battlefield as a method of close combat for defeating an armored and armed opponent, in which one uses no weapon or only a short one. It was a system of attack that involved throws, joint locks, chokes, strikes, pinning and capturing an opponent, stabbing, as well as defenses against these attacks. Although jiu-jitsu techniques were known from the earliest times, it was not until the second half of the 16th century that it was practiced and taught systematically. By the mid-1800s, there were countless jiu-jitsu systems practiced throughout Japan. It was during this time that Japanese politics disintegrated into disarray. Following the opening of Japan to the West by American Commodore Matthew Perry, Jiu-Jitsu gradually shifted its focus from battlefield to self-defense application to better align with the needs of civil society. New techniques were created to adapt to this changing situation of non-armored opponents. In 1868, the Tokugawa shogunate, which had ruled Japan for over 200 years, lost its power. The emperor was restored to his supreme position, and the decline of the samurai class started along with a rapid decline in all martial arts. Although the Japanese government did not officially ban martial arts, people were not encouraged to learn or practice them. Jiu-Jitsu had become unfashionable in an increasingly westernized Japan. It literally fell into disuse. What was once the glory of the samurai was now looked down on, and many well-established jiu-jitsu schools began to disappear. Many of those who had once taught the art had been forced out of teaching. The few who still kept their schools open were now issuing challenges to the public and to other jiu-jitsu masters of various styles in order to make a living and attract new students. The rivalry between the styles was immense, and the challenges were often violent and brutal, sometimes resulting in the death of one of the participants. For that reason, some rules were created and some dangerous techniques were not allowed in these challenges anymore. In turn, Jiu-Jitsu started to take a more modern bent, as a martial art with sporting elements. After mastering the teachings of 2 classical Jiu-Jitsu styles, as well as researching other styles and martial arts, in 1882, Jigoro Kano created an eclectic style of Jiu-Jitsu, characterized by an emphasis on throwing techniques. Kano initially named his style Kano Ryu or Kano Jiu-Jitsu, subsequently naming it Kodokan Judo. Integrating what he considered the positive elements of those styles with his own ideas and inspirations, and excluding some techniques that he considered dangerous or inefficient, he established a revised body of techniques and principles. The result was a new theoretical and technical system that Kano felt better matched the needs of modern people. The essence of his system is expressed in the axiom maximum efficiency, minimum effort, a concept he considered both a cornerstone of martial arts and a principle useful in many aspects of life. Practical application of this principle, he felt, could contribute to human and social development, including mutual prosperity for self and others, which he identified as the proper goal of training. What Kano had created transcended mere technique to embrace a set of principles for perfecting oneself. Kano believed that Jiu-Jitsu was insufficient to describe his art. Although Jutsu means art or system, it implies a method consisting of a collection of physical techniques. Accordingly, he changed the second character to Do, meaning way or path, which implies a more philosophical context than Jutsu. Thus, Kano renamed it Judo, a term that had already been used before within some specific jiu-jitsu styles. He named his dojo Kodokan, or a place to teach the path. In the following decades, marked by intense rivalry and exchange of knowledge and techniques with other jiu-jitsu schools, Kano enriched his art by incorporating advanced groundwork techniques. Kodokan Judo proved its effectiveness in Japanese territory, defeating most jiu-jitsu schools and inviting them to follow the Kodokan curriculum, which most of them did, helping to consolidate Kodokan in Japan. It was now time to export this new, modernized style of jiu-jitsu to the Western world. For several decades, the distinction between judo and jiu-jitsu was not clear even in Japan. During the late 19th and early 20th century, outside of Japan, the lack of differentiation between the terms judo and jiu-jitsu was compounded by a lack of consistency in transliteration and usage of the terms when transitioned from the Japanese language to Western languages. In addition, judo masters were not the only ones traveling to the West. Jiu-jitsu masters were also on a mission to export their art, often training and traveling together with their judo compatriots, as we can see in this video of judo master Takisaburo Tobari, demonstrating a series of techniques partnered by jiu-jitsu master Taro Miyake in Paris 1912. Jiu-jitsu became the new craze in the Western world, fueled by the victory of the Japanese military over the Russians in the 1904-05 Russo-Japanese War. The effectiveness of their martial art, especially the ability to defeat bigger and stronger opponents, was commonly associated with their victory in the war, where the smaller nation defeated the bigger one. Even President Ted Roosevelt became an avid jiu-jitsu student. His first instructor was fellow American John J. O'Brien, who for 10 years served as a police inspector in Japan, receiving a jiu-jitsu diploma from the governor of Nagasaki. In subsequent years, the president would continue his jiu-jitsu training under judo master Yoshitsugu Yamashita. Jiu-jitsu was a generic and broad term used to identify the martial art practiced by the Japanese masters, regardless of their style. The terms judo and jiu-jitsu were used interchangeably even by the Japanese, as we can see in the title of this book, written by judo master Mitsuyo Maeda, originally published in 1913 in the final years of his European tour. Maeda toured Europe along with jiu-jitsu masters Taro Miyake and Sadakazu Uenishi. Uenishi would join Maeda's troupe again in the following year, in Brazil. Here's another example from 1937, authored by Jigoro Kano himself. This 40-volume book was published by the Japanese government and aimed to promote Japanese culture to tourists visiting Japan. Kano probably recognized that the term jiu-jitsu was still very common in the West. Jiu-jitsu and judo would prove their effectiveness through challenge matches against other martial arts, especially wrestling, boxing, and catch wrestling. The rules would vary greatly even from one round to another, including gi, no gi, and no time, no weight limit matches. These challenge matches were extremely beneficial to the Japanese masters, helping them to further refine their martial arts skills. Some of them became quite famous and started to make a career as prize fighters. The Japanese also taught their art to the military and police force of several countries in the West. In 1908, the Brazilian Navy hired 2 masters from Kodokan, Sada Miyako, his real name was Miura Sakuzo, and his assistant, Yume Kakihara. They both identified themselves as jiu-jitsu instructors. They came from Japan aboard the Brazilian training ship Benjamin Constant, where they taught their first lessons to the cadets aboard. Once on Brazilian soil, the Japanese masters taught at the Naval Academy in Rio de Janeiro, producing many jiu-jitsu instructors, who were then in charge of spreading the new martial art to their military branch. Sada Miyako also performed in challenge matches and public demonstrations. In one of those challenges, he faced capoeira master Francisco Siriaco. Capoeira is an Afro-Brazilian martial art developed over the centuries during the period of slavery in Brazil. The elitist Brazilian Navy faced hard criticism from nationalists who favored capoeira as the ideal self-defense system for the military. The crowd burst into cheers when Siriaco knocked out Miyako with a circular kick called rabo de arraia, or stingray's tail. Siriaco was immediately elevated to celebrity status. Miyako kept teaching at the Navy for a few more years until the end of his contract. One of his students, Mario Aleixo, kept Miyako's legacy alive by mixing up the jiu-jitsu that he had learned with boxing and capoeira, creating a unique self-defense system which was taught in the Brazilian Army for almost a decade. In September of 1914, a troop of Japanese masters arrived in Brazil, led by Mitsuyo Maeda, also known as Conde Koma. Maeda was a very experienced martial artist. He had trained at Kodokan in Japan for 10 years and had then traveled the world spreading his art, along with other judo and jiu-jitsu masters for another decade before arriving in Brazil. He was one of the most vigorous promoters of judo in the West, although not by teaching the art, instead generating recognition of judo through his many combats with contenders from other disciplines. Maeda's involvement with prize fighting, which was against the strict moral codes of Kodokan, may have troubled his relationship with it. This may explain why he and other Japanese professional fighters had their belt promotions slowed down enormously. Maeda was also familiar with no-gi grappling, having competed successfully at catch wrestling tournaments during his tour in the US. Maeda's troupe in Brazil consisted of 3 Kodokan judo masters, Satake, Shimizu, and Okura, in addition to jiu-jitsu master Sadakazu Yonishi, also known as Raku or Laku in Portuguese. They moved throughout the country teaching thousands of military cadets, giving demonstrations and accepting all challengers, settling in the Amazon region in 1916, during the start of the downturn of the rubber-based economy. In the beginning of that same year, 2 members of the troupe, Satake and Laku, were offering jiu-jitsu classes at the Alcazar Theater in the city of Manaus. Maeda was also teaching in Belém do Pará. Aware of the great success of the Japanese fighters in the Amazon region, a Scottish Brazilian entertainment entrepreneur named Gaston Gracie hired the troupe to perform challenge matches in his circus. Along with theaters and cinemas created to entertain the emerging middle class in the Amazon, circuses filled their tents by staging blood sports type of spectacles. It was around this time that Gaston's eldest son, Carlos Gracie, joined Maeda's dojo. Carlos, a 15-year-old teenager at the time, studied under Maeda and his senior student, Jacinto Ferro, for no more than 3 years, acquiring a solid foundation before moving to Rio de Janeiro with his family around 1920. Carlos' exposure to Maeda's teachings occurred under a circumstantial combination of factors that determined the nature of his apprenticeship. Maeda's lack of interest in training students to perpetuate the Kodokan Judo School is noteworthy. For example, he ignored the belt ranking conceived by Jigoro Kano, which constituted one of the pedagogical foundations of the Kodokan Judo School. Moreover, Maeda at this time was deeply involved in prize fighting. Under these circumstances, by employing the generic label Jiu-Jitsu instead of the specific name of his school, Judo, Maeda was consistent with his current professional prizefighter status. Lastly, the absence of students who had trained under Maeda in the Amazon and graduated with the rank of black belt is emblematic. It confirms that he did not intend to create local lineages of Kodokan Judo practitioners. It's important to note that, regardless of the terminology, Judo or Jiu-Jitsu, Students like Carlos Gracie at the time learned self-defense techniques in a grappling-based martial art that had the objective of subduing opponents via joint locks and strangleholds, refined over the decades through challenge matches against other martial arts under very few rules, rather than winning by points, pinning techniques, or perfect throws, which are characteristics of sport judo rules. The circumstances surrounding the encounter between Mitsui Maeda and the Gracies had long-term consequences for jiu-jitsu practice in Brazil. Unlike the introduction of Kodokan Judo in other regions of the Western world, in Brazil thereafter, the Gracies near monopolized its practice by keeping the pre-modern denomination Jiu-Jitsu. Maeda would retire from professional prize fighting in 1920, initiating his process of reconciliation with the Kodokan around the same time that Carlos Gracie moved to Rio de Janeiro. In Rio, Carlos Gracie initially worked at the local water and power company for a few years, before he started teaching jiu-jitsu classes to a small group of students at his workplace. Meanwhile, he would study martial arts books to supplement his knowledge, in addition to teaching and training with his brothers, Osvaldo, Gastão Jr., George, and Hélio at home. Apparently and by chance, Carlos one day came across Donato Pires dos Reis, an old family acquaintance from their time in the Amazon. Donato also had been one of Maeda's students, and through political connections, was hired by the Minas Gerais State Police as a jiu-jitsu instructor. Donato then invited Carlos to be his assistant. He accepted. Carlos taught jiu-jitsu in Minas Gerais from 1928 to 1930. Deciding to pursue his career as a professional fighter after that. Donato, who was also a successful amateur boxer, may have shared his knowledge with Carlos, helping him in preparation for his fighting career. His first two matches were against Japanese immigrant Gio Omori, a Kodokan black belt who was also very experienced in catch wrestling, which he had learned during his stay in the US. Both matches ended in a draw, and Carlos and Omori became great friends. Omori is considered as one of the most important contributors to the refinement of Carlos' grappling techniques after he left Maeda's dojo. Also, Omori trained hundreds, if not thousands, of Brazilian students, blending his lineage with other masters' lineages, helping in the creation of what would be later known as Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. Carlos became quite famous after his matches against Omori, prompting his old friend Donato Pires dos Reis to open a jiu-jitsu school in Rio de Janeiro, named Academy of Jiu-Jitsu in 1930. Donato hired Carlos as an instructor and his brother, George, as an assistant instructor. Less than a year later, in 1931, Carlos and Donato had a big falling out, arguing over how challenge matches should be dealt with by the school. Donato ended up transferring the school's ownership to Carlos, who changed its name to Gracie Academy of Jiu-Jitsu. It was at this school that Carlos and his brothers started to teach and train full-time in preparation for their subsequent challenge matches. These matches helped the Gracie brothers and their school to become very popular in Rio de Janeiro, establishing themselves as authorities in the field. The Gracie brothers, especially Osvaldo, George, and Hélio, performed several challenge matches in the 1930s, varying in style from jiu-jitsu-only matches to vale tudo fights against various martial arts, often competing against foreigners. Their biggest rivals were the Japanese immigrants living in Brazil. Brazil is home to the largest Japanese population outside Japan, and unsurprisingly, some of those immigrants were Kodokan Judo black belts who ended up facing the Gracies multiple times, like Gio Omori, as I've mentioned before, Takeo Iano, and the Ono brothers. Those challenge matches against the Japanese were the turning point in the creation of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The Gracies resorted to a defensive ground strategy based on the application of a position known as the guard to compensate the Japanese superiority on throwing techniques. It was not uncommon for the Japanese judokas to throw the Gracies dozens of times per match. In fact, the emphasis on ground combat by the Gracies was primarily a strategy devised to survive their rivals, and not with any deliberate purpose of creating such a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu style. The style proved to be effective against the Japanese fighters. Although most matches ended up in a draw, the Gracies had more wins than losses. Over the years, with the addition of new rules by the Kodokan, the growing specialization in standing techniques led the Japanese fighters to gradually neglect ground combat. The Gracies then filled the technical gap by focusing their jiu-jitsu practice on ground combat. So while keeping the techniques in their original form, they worked out a ground combat style based on a defensive strategy, but they made it offensive through the application of chokes and joint locks from the bottom position. The Gracie brothers created a local jiu-jitsu culture by refusing to abide by technical, philosophical, and cultural aspects of the Japanese matrix. As a result, they laid the foundations of what's known today as Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. It's also important to mention that the Gracies had the support of a very nationalist political establishment at the time, which described them as symbols of our nation, helping in the creation of a national identity for their martial art. Their association with the establishment also helped to protect them against occasional misdemeanors, as in the infamous incident with catch wrestler Manuel Rufino dos Santos, where Gracie brothers Carlos, Hélio, and George were charged with battery. The brothers were eventually pardoned by Brazilian President Getúlio Vargas in 1934. The Gracie brothers had many children between them, most of whom were trained from a young age, resulting in the next generation of Gracie fighters, who continued to improve and develop their style, also adding new techniques from other martial arts and eventually spreading it to the world. Although the Gracie family is and will always be regarded as the most important element in the creation and development of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, many of their students and students of their students have also contributed immensely to the refinement of the art. We also shouldn't forget the contributions of the non-Gracie lineages to the development of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Two of the biggest competition teams today, GF Team and Nova União, can be traced back to Grandmaster Osvaldo Fada, who learned Jiu-Jitsu from Luiz França, one of Mitsuyo Maeda's students from the Brazilian Navy. Top competitor Gibson Sá is another example, son of one of the pioneers of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in the state of Ceará, Grandmaster Francisco Sá, who was a direct student of Takeo Iano. To sum up and to clarify some common misconceptions, we can divide Judo and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu into two distinct periods. Judo before and after the Second World War, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu before and after the creation of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Confederation in 1994. The Judo that was introduced into Brazil and into many other Western countries, commonly referred to Jiu-Jitsu at the time even by the Japanese, was mainly a grappling and wrestling-based combat sport with very few restrictions or rules, developed in challenge matches against other martial arts, and offering self-defense techniques against strikes and weapons. That's what the Brazilians learned, modified according to their preferences, and stuck to, despite the gradual changes and restrictions imposed on Judo by the Kodokan over the years, especially after the World War II, with the intention of turning Judo into an Olympic sport, which finally happened in 1964. Kodokan Judo still has its self-defense techniques against strikes and weapons, but it's mostly practiced as kata, a pre-arranged pattern of attack and defense. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu suffered a similar fate to that of Judo, with the creation of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Confederation in 1994, which organized and heavily promoted Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a sport, contributing tremendously to new technical advancements and to the popularity of the art, but neglecting its self-defense aspect. Many generations of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners learned only the sport element of the art. The main difference is that the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Confederation is not an official governing body of the art. It only governs the rules of their own tournaments. So Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu schools nowadays vary widely in terms of instruction, from self-defense based to sport-based and anything in between. Now, that's not to say that Judo and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioners who specialize in their respective sports will not have the ability to defend themselves in a real fight or self-defense situation. They more than likely will, but the training methodology and selection of techniques have differing focuses. Hope you guys have liked this video. Please leave your comment below. I would love to hear from you.